Imagine being hailed as, like, the absolute next Mahatma Gandhi.
Right. A total global icon.
Exactly. You win the Nobel Peace Prize, your name literally becomes synonymous with human rights, democracy, peaceful resistance against tyranny.
Hey, the ultimate prisoner of conscience.
Right. Locked inside your own home for 15 years
Oh.
while the entire world campaigns for your release. But then imagine that a few decades later, you are standing in an international court. And you're acting as the primary defender for a military accused of carrying out a genocide.
Yeah, it's a staggering contradiction.
How does one single human being live both of those lives? So, okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are exploring one of the most complex, inspiring, and just ultimately polarizing biographical arcs in modern history.
It really is the ultimate geopolitical paradox. I mean, it's a whiplash that the international community is honestly still trying to process.
Yeah.
When we look at this biographical landscape, or, as it is recorded in Burmese history, Aladadale, we're looking at a story that completely shatters those neat little binary boxes of hero and villain.
Totally. And I want to be really clear right up front about our mission for this deep dive. The sources we are working with today are incredibly heavy.
Very heavy. We're talking about extensive biographical records, political histories, legal documents.
Yeah, and they cover highly charged allegations, ethnic cleansing, genocide, brutal military coups, basically spanning from her birth in 1945 all the way up to the latest geopolitical updates in 2026.
Right. And because of that, we need to explicitly state that we are not taking any political sides here.
Never.
Right.
We're not endorsing any specific viewpoints. Our goal is just to impartially report the facts, the claims, and the actions exactly as they are presented in the source material.
Because you really have to see the whole board, right? The brutal realities of political power, the compromises. You need all of that to understand how this actually happened.
Exactly. If you've ever wondered what happens when a pure global symbol of resistance actually gains power, well, this is the deep dive for you.
So to understand how she ends up in that international court in The Hague, I mean, we really have to understand the foundational mythology she was born into.
Because before she's a politician or a prisoner or this global icon, she is a daughter.
Right. And in this specific case, her name is literally a map of her country's history.
Yeah, the name breakdown is fascinating. Let's look at that. In Burmese tradition, they don't have surnames, right?
Exactly, no surnames. Her name is this completely composite entity that binds her to her lineage. So, Aung San comes from her father.
Okay.
Suu comes from her paternal grandmother, and Kyi comes from her mother, Kin Kyi. But, the absolute gravitational center of that name is Aung San.
Because Aung San isn't just some prominent historical guy in Myanmar. He is the father of the nation.
He is the architect of modern Burma. I mean, he founded the modern Burmese army. And during World War II, he famously allied with the Japanese to fight the British. But then he recognized the geopolitical winds were shifting, so he allied with the British to drive out the Japanese.
Talk about political maneuvering.
Yeah, and ultimately, he was the man who successfully negotiated Burma's independence from the United Kingdom in 1947.
But the tragedy is, he doesn't even get to see the country he built.
No, he doesn't. That very same year, just months before the formal Declaration of Independence, he was assassinated by political rivals.
Right, during an executive council meeting. And Aung San Suu Kyi was, 2 years old?
Just 2 years old when he was murdered.
So she has no conscious memory of him at all. But she is just completely defined by his legacy. I mean, every single time someone says her name, they are invoking the martyred founder of the nation.
It's an immense psychological weight. But, her mother, Kin Kai, she steps into the void left by that assassination. She becomes this formidable political force in her own right.
Yeah, the sources say she didn't just fade into private grief. She became a really prominent figure in the new Burmese government.
Mostly focusing on social welfare, right? And that trajectory eventually takes her to the international diplomatic stage. In 1960, she's appointed as the Burmese ambassador to India and Nepal.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because this is where her story diverges from what you'd expect.
How so?
Well, you'd expect a future revolutionary to be, fighting in the streets. But she leaves Rangoon, which is now Yangon, and she steps into this highly international, cosmopolitan, frankly, elite upbringing.
Oh, absolutely. She moves to New Delhi. She attends a convent school there. She's suddenly immersed in this vibrant, newly independent India.
Right.
She graduates from Delhi University with a degree in politics in 1964. And then the aperture of her world just widens even more. She heads to the UK to attend Oxford.
St. Hugh's College, specifically, studying philosophy, politics, and economics. And based on these biographical records, she wasn't exactly leading student protests in London, was she?
Not at all. I mean, she graduates, eventually gets her master's, and her life just takes on this very quiet, bureaucratic, almost academic rhythm.
Yeah, she moves to New York City. She lives with a family friend who, fun fact, was a former Burmese pop singer.
Thinny.
Right. And then she takes a job at the United Nations. But she isn't, like, drafting human rights treaties. She spends 3 years dealing with budget matters.
Budget matters.
The future icon of democratic resistance is essentially doing UN accounting.
It sounds so mundane, but think about it from a mechanical perspective. She was learning how massive, complex international bureaucracies actually function.
Oh, that's a good point.
She's seeing the machinery of global governance from the inside, totally stripped of its ideological romance.
Seeing how the sausage is made, how funding works, institutional friction, all of that. And it's during this UN time that she develops a connection that really shapes the rest of her life, right?
Yes. While she's in New York, she is corresponding daily with Michael Aris.
The British scholar.
Right, a scholar of Tibetan culture. And he's living in this incredibly isolated, high-altitude kingdom of Bhutan at the time. They had met earlier in the UK, and their connection was just profound. They marry in 1972, she joins him in Bhutan, and eventually they settle back in the UK.
They have 2 sons, Alexander and Kim. And she just dives right back into academia.
Working on a Master of Philosophy in Burmese literature in London.
So let's just pause and look at this snapshot. She's a mother. She's a scholar. Living in the UK, married to a British academic.
Right.
She has spent her life in New Delhi, Oxford, New York, Bhutan, London. For decades, she is entirely separated from the day-to-day grit of Burmese domestic politics.
She is essentially a political royal living in comfortable exile. She's quietly accumulating all these global perspectives, entirely insulated from the authoritarian reality of Burma under military rule.
So how does that flip? How does a quiet academic in London suddenly find herself at the absolute center of a violent national revolution? I mean, there's no connective tissue there.
The connective tissue is a really tragic collision between personal life and national collapse. In 1988, she does not travel to Burma to start a political movement. She returns to Rangoon for a very intimate domestic reason. Her mother, Kin Kai, has suffered a severe stroke, so Aung San Suu Kyi returns just to care for her.
A simple trip home to nurse her sick mother. But the timing, it's one of the most consequential coincidences in modern history.
Exactly, because she arrives in a country that is an absolute powder keg.
Yeah, set the stage for us there.
Yeah.
What was happening in Burma in 1988?
So for over 2 decades, Burma had been ruled by General Ne Win. He had implemented this system called the Burmese way to socialism.
Right.
It was an isolationist, authoritarian system that had just absolutely decimated the economy. Burma went from being one of the wealthiest countries in Southeast Asia to literally one of the poorest in the world.
And right as she returns to sit by her mother's hospital bed, that powder keg finally explodes. General Ne Win suddenly steps down,
leaving a massive, terrifying power vacuum.
Right.
All that economic frustration, decades of repression, it just spills out into the streets, and it culminates in the 88 uprising.
August 8th, 1988. The sources note that date was seen as highly auspicious in Burmese numerology.
Right. And mass democratic demonstrations erupt everywhere. Students, monks, doctors, ordinary citizens, they all take to the streets demanding an end to military rule.
Demanding a democratic government. But the military, I mean, Ne Win might be gone, but the military apparatus is still very much intact, right? How do they respond?
With absolute unyielding violence. The armed forces are ordered to fire on unarmed protesters.
Wow.
Thousands of people are killed in the streets of Rangoon and across the country. It is a total bloodbath. And into this sheer chaos, Aung San Suu Kyi steps out of her mother's hospital room.
Literally. Because Yangon General Hospital is overwhelmed with the dead and wounded from these protests. She makes her first public appearance there on August 24th.
And then 2 days later, she does something that alters the trajectory of the country forever.
Right. August 26th. She steps up to a podium outside the Shwedagon Pagoda, which is the most sacred Buddhist site in Myanmar. And she addresses a crowd.
A crowd of an estimated 500,000 people.
Stop and visualize that. 500,000 people. She hasn't lived in the country for decades. She's an academic. But she stands in front of this traumatized, desperate sea of people, and she just speaks.
She calls for a democratic government. She invokes her father's name, declaring that she could not, as her father's daughter, remain indifferent to all that was going on.
It's the political equivalent of being struck by lightning.
It was a completely galvanic moment. The people were desperate for a unifying figure. You know, the student leaders and the monks, they had the numbers, but they didn't have a single unassailable voice that could transcend all the different factions.
And she had the ultimate unifying name. Plus the international credibility of her education.
And her pristine distance from the corruption of the previous regimes. She was a clean slate.
But she doesn't just give a speech and fly back to London. She realizes she has to build a political machine to actually harness this energy. So in September 1988, she helped found the National League for Democracy, the NLD.
She becomes its general secretary. And she doesn't just lend her name to it, she defines its entire operational and moral philosophy.
And the sources highlight that this philosophy is deeply rooted in nonviolence. She drew heavily from Mahatma Gandhi and her own Buddhist beliefs. But I have to imagine that telling a population that is actively being gunned down in the streets to remain nonviolent, that was a tough sell.
Oh, it created immediate internal friction. So the military had reorganized itself into a new junta, calling itself the State Law and Order Restoration Council, later the SPDC.
Right.
Their rule was brutal. Now, when she formed the NLD, she actually had the backing of several high-ranking, retired army officials who were disillusioned with the junta.
Ex-military men in her inner circle. How did they feel about this Gandhian approach?
They strongly disagreed with it. These former commanders felt she was being way too confrontational by insisting on massive, public, nonviolent protests.
Because they knew it would provoke a violent response.
Exactly. They wanted a more cautious, negotiated approach. They eventually clashed with her so much that they left the party.
But the youth, the students actually on the front lines, they gravitated toward her, didn't they?
They absolutely adored her. She spent enormous amounts of time with them, traveling the country, building a massive grassroots following.
And the thing is, her adoption of strict nonviolence was actually a direct existential threat to the military junta.
Wait, unpack that for the listener. How is nonviolence an existential threat to a military that has literally all the guns?
Well, authoritarian regimes rely on violence from their opponents to justify their own crackdowns. If the NLD had taken up arms, the military could have easily labeled them as terrorists or insurgents.
Oh, right, and crushed them with the full weight of the state.
Exactly, claiming they were just restoring order.
Yeah.
But by remaining strictly nonviolent, Aung San Suu Kyi stripped the junta of their justification. Every single time the military attacked a peaceful protest, it only delegitimized the regime further in the eyes of the public and the whole international community.
It's political judo. She is using their own brutality against them to build moral capital.
But the junta isn't stupid. They realize what she's doing. And they also realize they can't just shoot the daughter of Aung San in the street without causing a massive international incident.
Right, so they try to manage the situation through a different mechanism. In an attempt to legitimize their rule, the junta actually agrees to hold a general election in 1990.
Which, reading this, seems like a massive miscalculation on their part.
It was a staggering miscalculation. They really believed that by tightly controlling the media and intimidating voters, their proxy party could just win.
But the results were an absolute rebuke of military rule. Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the NLD, won 59% of the popular vote.
Which, in a parliamentary system, translated to 392 out of 492 seats. They won 80% of the parliament.
A total landslide. Under any normal democratic framework, she would have assumed the office of prime minister right then there.
But the military simply refuses to recognize the results.
Just refuses.
Yeah. They argue that the country needs a new constitution before power can be transferred. They basically just nullify the entire election.
How does a government even function after ignoring an 80% landslide? What was the international reaction to that?
The reaction was intense condemnation, but practically speaking, there was very little the global community could do to force the junta's hand. The military controlled the borders, the economy, and the guns.
Right.
And their solution to the problem of her overwhelming popularity was to completely isolate her.
And this begins the defining era of her life. She isn't leading a country. She is locked inside her family home on University Avenue, right next to Inya Lake in Yangon.
Yes. From 1989 to 2010, a 21-year period, she spent nearly 15 of those years under house arrest.
15 years. We really need to explore the mechanics of this isolation because the sources show it wasn't some cushy retirement. She was completely cut off.
The psychological toll was immense. The junta heavily restricted her visitors. Her phone lines were frequently cut. She was constantly under surveillance.
A war of attrition.
Exactly. They wanted her to fade from the public consciousness. They wanted to break her spirit.
But she fought back against that psychological warfare. She kept a really rigid schedule. She read extensively philosophy, politics, biographies that her husband managed to send her.
She meditated. She played the piano.
Yeah, she played the piano until it literally broke from the humidity and a lack of tuning. She was fortifying her mind.
And the junta knew this, so they offered her a way out. Multiple times they approached her and offered her absolute freedom with one single devastating catch.
She had to leave the country.
Right, and she refuses every single time.
Because she knew that if she left Myanmar, the junta would never let her return. The democratic movement would lose its figurehead.
The regime would have won, so she chose to stay.
And we really need to sit with the human cost of that choice. Because it meant she was entirely separated from her family. Her 2 sons were growing up in the UK without their mother. And her husband, Michael Eris. I mean, this is where the political math becomes agonizingly personal.
It is incredibly tragic. After her initial detention in 1989, she rarely saw Michael. And by the late 1990s, he was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer.
Oh, wow.
He applied for a visa to visit her in Myanmar just to say goodbye. The junta denied his visa over 30 times.
30 times. The cruelty of that is just staggering. They essentially held his death hostage. They told her, if you want to see your dying husband, you can leave.
They assured her she could return, but she knew it was a lie. She knew the moment she stepped on a plane, the door to her country would close forever.
She had to make a choice between the country her father built and the husband she loved, and she chose the country.
From the time she was first detained until Michael died on his 53rd birthday in 1999, she had only seen him 5 times. She did not even attend his funeral.
That level of resolve is almost alien to the average person. To sacrifice your family, your husband's final days for a political ideal. But it's that exact sacrifice that builds this impenetrable aura of sainthood around her globally.
Absolutely. By physically confining her and forcing her into these agonizing personal sacrifices, the junta inadvertently amplified her moral authority to the entire world. She became the ultimate prisoner of conscience.
In 1991, while she's sitting in isolation, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awards her the Nobel Peace Prize. Her son, Alexander, has to accept it on her behalf. And in 1999, Time magazine names her one of the children of Gandhi.
She became a pure, untarnished symbol. Because she was locked away, she didn't have to engage in the messy, compromising, morally gray reality of actual governance.
She existed as a perfect ideal.
Exactly. And it wasn't just isolation she faced. She survived active physical threats, too.
Right, because there were brief periods where she was released and she tried to mobilize her supporters, and the military responded brutally, like the Depane massacre in 2003.
Yes. She and her convoy were traveling in the Saging region. They were ambushed by a government-sponsored mob. At least 70 people associated with her party were beaten to death.
It's horrific.
She only survived because her driver managed to literally force their way through the mob.
And the immediate result of surviving an assassination attempt. The junta puts her right back into secret detention and then back to house arrest at that dilapidated house by the lake.
She was there through Cyclone Nargis in 2008, surviving without a roof in some rooms, completely isolated.
But eventually, the international pressure, crippling economic sanctions from the West, and the internal realization that their isolationist model was failing it, forced the junta's hand.
They realized they needed a pressure release valve.
Which brings us to the moment the world had been waiting decades for. In November 2010, the junta finally loosens its grip. The gates of the compound on University Avenue are opened, and Aung San Suu Kyi is released.
And her political ascent from that moment is rapid.
Yeah.
The junta had organized elections in 2010, which her party actually boycotted because the rules were completely rigged. But by 2012, she decides to engage with the system. She runs in the by-elections and wins a seat in parliament.
It's just an incredible image, the famous prisoner walking into the parliament building of the regime locked her up, and this sets the stage for the 2015 general election.
Right. The NLD participates fully, and the result is a staggering landslide victory. They won absolute majorities in both chambers of the national parliament.
The people of Myanmar had finally delivered the mandate they were denied in 1990. But the military junta, in anticipation of this exact scenario, had fundamentally rigged the constitutional framework years earlier.
We really need to dive into the mechanics of that 2008 constitution, because the military didn't just hand over the keys to the country.
Far from it. The 2008 Constitution was drafted entirely by the military, and they included a very specific clause, Section 59F.
And what did that do?
It explicitly barred anyone with a foreign spouse or foreign-born children from assuming the presidency.
Which is a clause written with surgical precision targeting one single human being on the planet. Aung San Suu Kyi.
Exactly. Her late husband was British, her sons are British, so despite her party winning an overwhelming mandate, she is constitutionally blocked from being the president.
But the NLD finds a legislative workaround.
They do.
They create a brand new position specifically for her called State Counsellor. It is essentially equivalent to a prime minister. She also takes on the role of Minister of Foreign Affairs.
So from 2016 to 2021, she becomes the de facto leader of Myanmar.
But I want to pause here, because this is where the narrative shifts from a fairy tale to a geopolitical nightmare.
Yeah, let's look at the actual mechanics of the power she inherited. It's like finally being given the keys to the car you've been fighting for your whole life, but realizing the people who locked you in a cage for 15 years are sitting in the passenger seat with their hands firmly gripped on the emergency brake.
That is exactly the dynamic. The 2008 Constitution ensured that the military, the Tatmadaw, retained massive unchecked power. They were guaranteed 25% of the seats in parliament.
Which matters because constitutional changes required more than 75% approval, right?
Right. So the military effectively held an absolute veto over any constitutional reform. She couldn't change the rules without their permission.
Furthermore, the Constitution gave the military direct, exclusive control over 3 key ministries: defense, home affairs, and border affairs.
Meaning she has no control over the army, the police, or the borders.
None. She had to govern alongside the very armed forces that had assassinated her father, murdered her supporters, and imprisoned her.
On top of that, she inherited a deeply fractured nation. She was trying to manage historical, violent ethnic conflicts in places like Shan and Kachin states, where multiple ethnic armed organizations have been fighting the central government for decades.
So she is walking a political tightrope over a volcano. She has immense popular support, but highly restricted institutional power. And this fragile, deeply compromised power-sharing arrangement sets the stage for the most heavily scrutinized chapter of her life.
Yes. The structural realities of governing Myanmar collide with her international reputation as a moral icon, leading to the crisis in Rakhine State.
The Rohingya crisis. Let's lay out exactly what happened, based strictly on the sources and historical records.
Okay, so in 2017, the military initiated what they called clearance operations in Rakhine State, which is in the western part of Myanmar. This was directed against the Rohingya, a predominantly Muslim minority group. The military's actions were characterized by extreme violence, mass murder, systemic rape, the burning of entire villages.
The scale of the displacement was apocalyptic. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya refugees fled across the border into neighboring Bangladesh. It created one of the largest humanitarian crises in modern history.
International observers, major human rights organizations, and various bodies of the United Nations investigated the events, and their conclusions were devastating.
They described the military's actions as ethnic cleansing, and several high-profile reports explicitly use the term genocide.
And the entire world looks to the State Counsellor. They look to the Nobel laureate, the woman who sacrificed everything for human rights.
They expect her to use her immense moral authority to condemn the military, to stand up for the Rohingya, to be the voice of the voiceless.
But she does not.
Wait, stop. She spent 15 years in prison by these exact generals. How does she justify not condemning them? What was her actual response?
Her response was a staunch defense of the state. In international interviews, she explicitly denied the allegations of ethnic cleansing.
And domestically?
Domestically, her government refused to grant citizenship to the Rohingya, offering only national verification cards, which effectively classified them as resident foreigners.
The sources even note that she asked the U.S. ambassador not to use the word Rohingya.
Yes. The government's position was that the Rohingya are not recognized as one of the official 135 ethnic groups native to Myanmar. Instead, they often referred to by the state as Bengalis, implying they are illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, despite many having lived in Rakhine State for generations.
Okay, we really need to examine the cold political math here. Why would she align herself with the military that tormented her? Is it pure political survival, or did she actually believe the military's narrative?
To understand her actions, you have to look at the domestic political landscape. Myanmar is a deeply fractured nation, but the majority ethnic group is the Bamar, who are predominantly Buddhist. Within Myanmar, there is a pervasive historical hostility toward the Rohingya, driven by complex layers of nationalism, religious friction, and colonial-era grievances.
So protecting the Rohingya was not a popular stance domestically.
It was political suicide domestically. The military's campaign in Rakhine State was actually highly popular among the Bamar majority.
Wow.
Some analysts point out that Aung San Suu Kyi was looking ahead to the 2020 elections. If she condemned the military and championed the Rohingya, she risked losing the support of her primary political base.
Potentially handing power right back to the military-backed parties. That is the aha moment of this entire saga. To stay in power domestically, she had to alienate the international community. It is a brutal, impossible catch-22.
And she didn't just stay silent. She actively defended them on the world stage.
The pinnacle of this shift occurs in December 2019. She travels to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice. The country of Gambia had brought a case against Myanmar, accusing the state of violating the Genocide Convention.
And Aung San Suu Kyi, the former political prisoner, stands up in the international court to lead the defense of the Burmese military.
I just can't wrap my head around that visual. What was her actual argument in court? How do you legally defend those actions?
Her defense, which is thoroughly documented in the sources, was highly technical and focused on state sovereignty. In a speech spanning over 3,000 words, she actively avoided using the term Rohingya.
Right.
She argued that the military's actions were a legitimate counter-terrorism response to coordinated attacks by a militant group called the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or RSA, which had attacked police outposts.
So she framed it as an internal security issue, not a targeted ethnic purge.
Exactly. She publicly questioned how there could be genocidal intent, which is the specific legal threshold for genocide, if the government had opened its own internal military investigations and was supposedly encouraging displaced people to return.
But the sources also note that international experts heavily criticized those internal military investigations as entirely insincere shams. I mean, logically, refugees who have had their villages burned are not going to return to a place where they have no rights and fear for their lives.
No, of course not. And the international reaction to her testimony was absolute revulsion.
It was a complete, devastating reversal of her global standing. The international community had projected this impossible standard of moral purity onto her, and when she prioritized domestic realpolitik over universal human rights, the backlash was immediate.
The list of revoked honors is staggering. Amnesty International, which had campaigned for her release for years, revoked her Ambassador of Conscience award.
Both chambers of the Canadian Parliament voted unanimously to strip her of honorary citizenship. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum rescinded the Elie Wiesel Award.
She lost the Freedom of the City Awards from Oxford, Dublin, and Edinburgh. And perhaps most painfully, fellow Nobel laureates figures who had stood by her, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama, publicly rebuked her silence and her actions.
And we have to note, it wasn't just the Rohingya crisis that damaged her reputation. Under her leadership, the fundamental democratic principle of press freedom took a massive hit.
Yes, the case of the Reuters journalists is highly illustrative of her government's approach. Two journalists, Wa Lone and Kyaw Soe Oo, were investigating the In Din massacre, where 10 Rohingya men had been executed by the military and local villagers.
Right.
During their investigation, they were arrested.
And the mechanics of this arrest are deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
The sources detail that a police officer literally testified in court that he was ordered by his superiors to entrap the journalists.
To hand them rolled up documents at a restaurant and then arrest them the moment they walked out.
Despite this glaring evidence of entrapment, Aung San Suu Kyi publicly defended their prosecution. She stated they weren't arrested for their journalism, but because they had broken the colonial-era Official Secrets Act.
She used a colonial law to jail journalists uncovering a massacre.
Yeah, she challenged critics to prove there had been a miscarriage of justice and coldly suggested the journalists could simply appeal to a higher court.
So we really have to look at this transformation. When she was a prisoner, she was an abstract ideal. When she became state councillor, she was a politician making ruthless calculations to maintain a fragile power-sharing agreement with the military.
She sacrificed her global moral standing to coexist with the generals.
But here is the ultimate crushing irony of those political calculations.
Hmm.
Appeasing the military, defending them at The Hague, shielding them from international accountability, it didn't save her.
The military didn't care about her loyalty at all.
Not at all. Which brings us to the final chapter of our deep dive, the 2021 coup and her return to captivity.
So leading up to 2020, her domestic strategy actually seems to work.
Yeah.
The Myanmar majority supports her stance on the Rohingya, and in the November 2020 general elections, the NLD wins another massive landslide victory.
They secure even more seats than they did in 2015.
And that massive victory is exactly what triggered the military's panic. The Tatmadaw realized that despite their constitutional safeguards, the NLD's popularity was so overwhelming that it threatened the military's long-term grip on the country's economic and political machinery.
So they revert to their oldest playbook. They claim the election was fraudulent.
Without providing credible evidence, of course.
Right. And on February 1st, 2021, the exact day the new parliament was scheduled to convene, they execute a coup d'etat.
They seize power, they declare a state of emergency, and they immediately arrest Aung San Suu Kyi, the president and the senior leadership of the NLD.
She is back exactly where she started in 1989, under arrest by a military junta.
But the legal mechanics the military uses this time to keep her locked up are almost surreal. The New York Times described the charges as esoteric and arcane.
Well, they needed to justify her detention legally, but they couldn't just say she was too popular. So the initial charge they used to detain her was that soldiers searching her villa allegedly found imported walkie-talkies that lacked the proper registration paperwork.
Walkie-talkies. They overthrew a democratically elected government over unregistered radios.
It was a transparent pretext. From there, the military levied a barrage of charges and closed-door secretive trials. They charged her with violating COVID-19 protocols during the election campaign.
Right.
They charged her with inciting dissent. They charged her with violating the very official Secrets Act she had used against the Reuters journalists.
There is a dark, poetic justice in that, however tragic.
And they piled on multiple counts of corruption, including allegations related to the misuse of funds for the purchase and rental of a helicopter for disaster relief.
They just threw the book at her.
Yeah.
Successive convictions kept piling up in these kangaroo courts. First a 4-year sentence, then more, eventually resulting in a staggering 33-year prison sentence.
Which was later slightly reduced to 27 years, following a partial pardon by the junta chief. But the reality is undeniable. Given her advanced age, it is effectively a life sentence.
The United Nations, the U.S., and most European countries universally condemned the trials as politically motivated shams.
But her circumstances now are so much darker than her first stint under house arrest.
They are. Because unlike in 1989, she no longer holds the unified, unconditional support of the international community. The campaigns for her release are muted compared to the global outcry of the 1990s.
And her physical condition is dire. We're looking at the latest updates from the sources up to 2026. She has been subjected to periods in solitary confinement in a specially constructed prison facility in Naypyidaw.
In April 2024, she was moved from prison to house arrest due to severe heat waves, but the health reports leaking out are terrifying.
Her son, Kim Eris, who still lives in the UK, has been desperately pleading for medical assistance for her. Reports indicate she is suffering from a severe toothache that leaves her unable to eat.
Oh, that's awful.
She reportedly has a heart condition and suffers from dizzy spells, and requests to see an outside medical specialist or a dentist have been repeatedly denied by the junta.
It's the same war of attrition they waged in the 90s, but now she's an elderly woman, and the political apparatus she spent her life building has been completely dismantled. The junta officially dissolved the National League for Democracy in March 2023.
And the international legal ramifications of her time as state councillor are still pursuing her. In an incredible legal development, in February 2025, a court in Argentina issued an arrest warrant against her and other Myanmar officials.
Wait, how can a court in Argentina issue an arrest warrant for crimes committed in Myanmar? Explain that mechanism.
They used a legal principle called universal jurisdiction.
Okay.
This principle holds that certain crimes, like genocide, torture, and crimes against humanity, are so exceptionally heinous that they harm the international community as a whole. Therefore, any national court, anywhere in the world, has the authority to prosecute the perpetrators, regardless of where the crime occurred or the nationality of the accused.
So an Argentine judge looked at the evidence of the Rohingya genocide and said, "We have the legal right to hold you accountable." It is just staggering to look at the full arc of this. To go from receiving the Nobel Peace Prize to having an international arrest warrant issued against you for genocide, all while sitting in solitary confinement under the very military you sacrificed your reputation to defend.
It forces us to confront the brutal reality of her legacy. By trying to walk a tightrope between a violent military and a fledgling democracy, by prioritizing domestic political survival over universal human rights, she ended up alienated from the global community and imprisoned by the generals she tried to appease.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, I want you, the listener, to think about the symbols and the heroes you admire today, the people you put on a pedestal. Aung San Suu Kyi's story forces you to ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
Is it fair to demand absolute moral perfection from political leaders? Or does the machinery of statecraft, the cold math of governing a fractured nation, inevitably compromise everyone who touches it? Can you survive in the mud without getting dirty?
And I'll leave you with one final provocative thread to pull on. While the international community continues to debate her legacy and her dramatic fall from grace, the people of Myanmar haven't stopped fighting.
Right.
Following the 2021 coup, a new generation is currently waging a massive spring revolution against the military junta. But what's truly fascinating is the mechanics of this new resistance. This time, they are fighting largely without relying on a single messianic figurehead.
Wow.
They aren't waiting for an icon to save them. They are building decentralized, multi-ethnic coalitions. If the era of the icon is dead in Myanmar, what does that mean for the future of democratic movements worldwide?
That is a brilliant question to end on. History is rarely a clean break. It is messy, it is contradictory, and it defies easy diagnosis.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex journey through the sources. Keep questioning the narratives you encounter, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.